becoming mayor of Winston-Salem and treasurer of the Democratic National Committee. His second, Zachary Smith Reynolds, was a noted playboy and aviator. He married a torch singer named Libby Holman and was shot to death at age 20 under strange and scandalous circumstances. His wife was indicted for murder but never tried. His name now graces the Winston-Salem airport. The burden of running Reynolds Tobacco fell to a succession of locally grown executives, several hand-picked by Mr. R.J. before his death. The first was Bowman Gray, a family favorite. Gray was a details man who had neither the dynamism nor the imagination to ignite real growth, but he did keep Reynolds on an even keel, slipping into his downtown office well before dawn each day and staying until well after dusk. His brother, James Gray, was a top banker at Wachovia, and the bank's interests became indistinguishable from Reynolds's. Gray would later come over to run Reynolds. Wachovia's executive committee, a select group of Reynolds's and Gray's and Moravian elders, became the town's ruling elite. Its members belonged to the prestigious Old Town Club and summered at Roaring Gap in the mountains 60 miles away. They married in a tight circle until the various branches of family trees became thoroughly entangled. This, of course, fostered a virulent strain of parochialism that haunts Winston-Salem to this day. A top Reynolds executive during the 1930s got that way in part by marrying Will Reynolds's niece. He got fired in part because he wouldn't live in Winston-Salem. Insulated from the outside world, the company was slow to pick up on trends, most seriously when it overlooked an emerging market for women smokers. Even though the bank robber Bonnie Parker was known to be a Camel devotee and once toured its factory while on the lam. As a result, Camel forfeited its lead in the cigarette business and was passed as the nation's bestseller by American Tobacco's Lucky Strikes in 1929. Aided by a small New York ad agency headed by William Estey, Reynolds launched a furious counterattack and recaptured the top spot in the 1930s. The Reynolds-Estey alliance kept the company's brands competitive for more than 50 years. The little burg was enormously proud of its big company, calling itself Camel City. Factory workers in overalls walked into stockbrokers' offices with paper bags full of cash and buy orders for Reynolds Tobacco. A factory worker named Hobart Johnson was one of the company's biggest shareholders for years, snapping up all the Class A stock he could afford every time some became available. Shares were handed from one generation to the next, with an admonition, "Don't you ever sell that Reynolds stock." The community's Moravian values became, if anything, even more imbued in the company. Work. Competitors, tobacco buyers, returned home and goofed off after the 8-month tobacco auction season. Reynolds's were assigned to cull the tobacco leaves they had bought, forcing them to contemplate the quality of their labors. Thrift. Reynolds workers were expected to turn in the stub of a pencil to get a new one. A young manager running a small fan in his office on a sultry summer day was admonished to unplug it, a waste of electricity. Ingenuity. The company developed a way to recycle scraps and stems of tobacco to greatly increase the usable amount of each leaf and greatly increase profits. Reconstituted tobacco, as it was called, was considered classic Reynolds, a blend of its manufacturing know-how and its waste-not, want-not culture. This was not, to be sure, paradise on the Piedmont. After Bowman Gray died in the mid-1930s, Reynolds endured more than a decade of tepid management. Among the workers there had always been minor grumbling. WS, as Winston-Salem was sometimes abbreviated, stood for work and sleep, they joked. During the 40s, the factory workforce was briefly unionized. Reynolds spent much of the decade trying to break the union's back, succeeding only when its leaders were tarred as communists. The distraction cost them, however, as sales fell behind those of arch-rival American Tobacco. But not for long. Under the leadership of Mr. Will's nephew, John Whitaker, Reynolds entered a new golden age in the 1950s. Having run one of Reynolds's first cigarette machines years before, Whitaker reinstated the sense of family in the company after the difficult union years. He liked to wander the factory floor, greeting workers by name and inquiring after their families. I remember some mornings pulling up beside Mr. Whitaker in his little brown Studebaker, a former employee recalled. He'd give me a wave, and I'd give him a wave back. We were going into work together. We were all after the same thing. There was an unwritten rule that Reynolds executives didn't drive anything bigger than a Buick. Even years later, when David Rockefeller came to Winston-Salem for a speech, an assistant asked that he be provided with a limousine. One couldn't be found in the entire city. Under Whitaker, Reynolds in 1954 introduced Winston, the first major filtered cigarette, 6.5 billion sold in its first 9 months. It followed that triumph with the first mass-marketed menthol cigarette, Salem, which also sold in the billions. In 1959, the two new brands, benevolently named for the city that spawned them, enabled Reynolds's sales to surge past American tobaccos. In Winston-Salem, they danced in the streets. Whitaker continued the Reynolds tradition of taking care of its town and its workers. He paid them better than union wage and set up one of the most generous corporate health programs in the country. For a nominal fee, employees and their families got free medical and dental care at a company-sponsored clinic. In the mid-50s, the company and the Reynolds family teamed to move Wake Forest University from its campus 100 miles to the east. The American tobacco heirs had moved a college to Durham and renamed it Duke University. Reynolds made sure Winston-Salem got the same treatment. Life was good then. Reynolds's Winston, Salem, and Camel were 3 of the top 4 best-selling cigarette brands. Prince Albert remained the top-selling pipe tobacco, and a brand called Day's Work was the top chewing tobacco. Americans were smoking like chimneys. In 1960, 58% of all men and 36% of all women smoked. It was often said that Reynolds's only problem was how to turn out cigarettes fast enough and how to ship all that money back to Wachovia Bank. In one respect, it was true. From a corporate executive's point of view, Reynolds had too much cash on its hands. In 1956, the company amended its charter to allow it for the first time to buy non-tobacco businesses. 2 years later, it came close to buying a pharmaceutical company named Warner Lambert. But when Charlie Wade, a senior vice president and board member, visited Warner headquarters in New Jersey, he made a shocking discovery. Warner Lambert's chairman sailed a company-owned yacht. "I came back and said, 'This is not for us. These are not our kind of people,'" recalled Wade. The deal died. Others recall it being more complicated than that, with directors also fearing that Warner Lambert's unionized workforce would prove to be a plague on Reynolds. But the picture captures the mindset of that era's Reynolds: frugal, suspicious of outsiders, protective of the status quo, profoundly anti-union. "You just had small-town thinking," says one retired executive, remembering that some directors wanted nothing to do with Yankees and unions. During the 50s, Reynolds was one great, happy family. Its executives never forgot that their company was run by the people who got up in the dark of the North Carolina countryside each morning, hopped into pickup trucks, and drove to the Reynolds factories, where they took pride in selecting the right tobacco leaves and knew the innards of each packing machine by heart. When Reynolds had to answer the all-important question of whether a new cigarette would sell, it turned to a panel of 250 of its own employees. The right formula for Winston was selected only after each worker smoked more than 250 trial mixtures. Finally, Bowman Gray Jr., the sales chief at the time, took the final puff. "This is it," he cried. Gray succeeded Whitaker in 1959. He was a typical Reynolds executive of the day. The son of Mr. R.J.'s right-hand man, Bowman Sr., he smoked 4 packs of Winston's daily and had worked for Reynolds since he was 11, when he spent summers trimming tobacco leaves. After selecting Winston, he trusted his own smoking taste above all. "I do believe if a cigarette appeals to me, I'm a pretty average fella, it might appeal to the population. Gray told Time magazine in 1960. But during the next decade, the population was forced to question whether it wanted to smoke any cigarette. Ever since tobacco was first rolled into cigarettes, there have been people opposed to smoking. King James I of Great Britain called it the lively image and pattern of hell and slapped an import tax on tobacco. Louis XIII of France and Tsar Michael I of Russia decreed penalties for smoking ranging from death to castration. Pope Urban VIII threatened excommunication for anyone found smoking in church or on church premises. But America's love affair with tobacco went largely unopposed until 1964, when Surgeon General Luther Terry issued his landmark report linking cigarette smoke with cancer. Cigarette sales, which had risen an average of 5% a year, fell sharply. Growth eventually resumed, but Reynolds saw and heeded the warning. Gray began buying businesses outside the tobacco industry, mostly in the food business, which Reynolds executives saw as an easy mark for their marketing acumen. Anyone who could sell a product linked with cancer, Reynolds executives were fond of saying, can sell anything. Reynolds compiled a mixed bag of brands: Hawaiian Punch, Vermont-made maple syrup, Mai Tea fine pudding, Chun-King Chinese food, Patio Mexican food. Its parochial nature, however, kept Reynolds from pursuing an opportunity that a newfound rival, Philip Morris of New York, was busily exploiting: overseas markets. Philip Morris was making millions selling its lead brand Marlboro around the world. Cocky, after years of market dominance, Reynolds executives liked to say that from the 22nd floor of headquarters, they could see everything the company owned. If somebody out there in the world wants a Camel, they joked, let them call us. But by the late 60s, the days when Reynolds could rest on its laurels were coming to a close. Gray, the last direct link to Mr. R.J.'s mantle, died in 1969. Two senior executives considered likely successors also died, and Gray was succeeded by his cousin, a weak-willed financial executive named Alex Galloway. Galloway proceeded to lead Reynolds on a disastrous diversification campaign that, in a deterioration similar to Nabisco's, would have far-reaching effects on the company's core tobacco business. At the suggestion of a former Winston-Salem businessman named Malcolm McLean, Galloway bought Sealand, a shipping company McLean owned. Given a seat on the Reynolds board, McLean next suggested that Galloway buy a small oil company named Ammonoil, which Reynolds acquired the next year. The idea was that Ammonoil's oil would be transported aboard Sealand's tankers. The next year, Galloway, in a move to reflect the company's diversification, changed the company's name to R.J. Reynolds Industries and, over the next decade, poured more than $2 billion into Ammonoil and Sealand, building the latter into the world's largest private shipping line. Taken for granted, the tobacco factories slowly fell apart. During his short caretaker reign, Galloway was largely under the sway of McLean and other powerful outsiders. The question of his successor became a matter of interest to one of them, a Reynolds director named J. Paul Stick. Stick was a rare outsider on the board. There were only two others when he joined in 1968. Rarer still, he was a Yankee who grew up in a boarding house outside Pittsburgh, the son of a German immigrant steelworker. Stick worked in the mills during high school and, after attending a nearby liberal arts school named Grove City College, went right back. He became a shop steward in the union and rose to become foreman. But behind his soft-spoken demeanor and blue-collar background, the fires of ambition burned as hot as any factory furnace. Stick soon left for the white-collar world, taking a job in personnel at Trans World Airways and later at Campbell's Soup. There, he quickly climbed the corporate ladder and by the late 1950s joined Federated Department Stores, the big Cincinnati retailer. By the mid-1960s, he was president and chief operating officer. Then, blocked from getting the top job, some say he was fired, Stick took early retirement in 1972 at the age of 55. He had joined the Reynolds board at the request of Charlie Wade, who had befriended him years earlier while comparing notes on union-busting tactics. Now, in 1972, Stick lobbied against replacing Galloway with his heir apparent, a financial man named David Peoples. After consulting the board's 3 other outside directors, Stick told Galloway they would all quit if Peoples was chosen. A search committee was formed to select a new successor, and Stick, with time on his hands, was named its chairman. After months of exhaustive searching, Stick's committee decided on a surprise choice to lead Reynolds into the late 70s, Paul Stick. Actually, Stick would be the number 2 executive, but in a new Hydra-headed executive structure, he would come to wield influence far beyond his station. His titular superior, a homegrown tobacco man named Colin Stokes, was a classic Reynolds executive. His father had been head of the leaf-drying house under Mr. RJ. A chain-smoking 40-year Reynolds veteran, Stokes had worked his way up from the factory floor and knew everything about cigarettes, but next to nothing of the world outside North Carolina. Stokes proved to be putty in Stick's hands. The difference in the 2 men who steered Reynolds through the 1970s was symbolized in their attitudes toward corporate jets. The company had kept a pair since the 1950s, when it painted one the color of a camel pack and the other a Salem pack. They were used so sparingly that one veteran pilot recalled logging only 37 minutes of flight time one month, long enough to get a jet aloft and make sure it was in working order. It reflected not only Reynolds's egalitarian spirit, but its executives' preference to stay home. Stokes and his friends particularly hated going to New York, and Larry Wassong, one of the company's New York ad men, would go to great lengths to ease the pain, arranging for Reynolds executives to be met at the airport, to have reservations at their favorite restaurants, to make sure they didn't end up on a Manhattan street corner befuddled. Mostly, Wassong went to Winston-Salem himself. Stick, however, was born for corporate jets. He had phones installed on them and personally made sure they had ample food and drink. Stick took it as his mission to show Stokes new far-flung places like Chicago and Boston. He formed an international advisory board, which included men such as Bunichiro Tonabe of Mitsubishi and Hermann Abs of Deutsche Bank. Twice a year, these and other foreign business titans were brought together with Reynolds executives to discuss global issues in exotic locales. Stick was determined to wrench some of the provincialism out of Reynolds. It was a dream come true for an ambitious man. One day an out-of-work retailer, the next a captain of industry. Stick loved rubbing shoulders with the corporate elite at the Business Roundtable in New York and U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington. He loved dropping the names of the people he hobnobbed with. Some muttered that he was more interested in the trappings of business than doing business. For all his whirl of motion, Stick procrastinated terribly on decisions and tried to sidestep executive suite conflicts. He preferred to come off as being above the fray, part statesman, part Dutch uncle. His voice was soft, his manner reserved. He remembered chauffeurs' names and asked after pilots' wives. In his courtly style and worldly ways, Stick in some ways was a perfect bridge from the old parochial Reynolds to the modern world. But as an outsider, he was never well received by Winston-Salem's old guard. Stick, a non-smoker, would occasionally light up a pipe, but it seemed more for effect than pleasure. On weekends, a Reynolds jet would fly him to his Palm Beach home in winter and his New Hampshire home in summer. His wife, Fern, was rarely seen in Winston-Salem. It was something of an insult to people who expected Reynolds' top brass to be at the center of the town's civic and social life. Stick wasn't at first admitted to the upper-crust Old Town Club and was relegated instead to the new money crowd at Bermuda Run. Dominating Colin Stokes, Stick navigated Reynolds through the tumultuous 1970s, a period that would transform the company from a family-dominated business into something approaching a modern conglomerate. He consolidated his power by ousting 3 top executives in a Watergate-era scandal involving illegal political contributions. Stick took control of that mess and another that broke on its heels. $19 million in illegal rebates paid by Sealand overseas, and in the process cemented his control over the company. There was a terrible foreboding among some that the fall of the company's good Moravian standards and the rise of Paul Sticht meant ruinous change. "You watch," warned Stuart Robertson, a local stockbroker. "We're going to have a bunch of Yankee carpetbaggers come in here. They'll have never seen this much money, and they won't know what to do with it." The next thing anyone knew, Reynolds was overrun with Yankees. The company had been under growing pressure during the 70s from its chief rival Philip Morris, whose Marlboro brand was growing in leaps and bounds, and Stick was convinced that more sophisticated marketers could beat back the challenge. For the first time, he brought a slew of outsiders to Winston-Salem, including Jim Peterson, the former president of Pillsbury, to head the domestic tobacco business, Morgan Hunter, a senior vice president of American Cyanamid, to be president of Reynolds Tobacco, Bob Anderson, a Lever Brothers executive, to head tobacco marketing, and J. Tiley Wilson, a Chesebrew Pond vice president, to run first the food businesses and later the company's long-overdue entry into overseas markets. The newcomers, Northerners almost to a man, stood out painfully at Reynolds. "It's not the end of the earth," they joked of Winston-Salem, "but you can see it from here." They mistook gentility for weakness, slowness of pace for lack of acumen, and Southern accents for dim-wittedness. "They would treat brilliant people as backwater rubes," recalled Larry Wassong, the ad executive. For all their self-assuredness, the new guard proved astoundingly inept at selling cigarettes. When cigarette ads were banned from the airwaves in 1971, Reynolds had to scrap its catchy jingle, "Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should." For years, Stick's new hires flailed about to find a proper substitute, tortuously reworking the line for print ads. "There's a lot of good between Winston and should." Bob Anderson compounded the problem by yanking Reynolds's brands off billboards, a crucial source of cigarette advertising. A succession of ad agencies was thrown at the problem, each with its own ideas, each with a new direction, each doomed to fail. Cigarettes are sold on image, and for years Reynolds executives held their brand images sacrosanct. Philip Morris had gained millions of Marlboro smokers by sticking with the same cowboy image since the 1950s. Now Reynolds tried a macho counteroffensive, with campaigns portraying loggers and sailors. It tried a Working Men of America campaign, trying to celebrate the blue-collar brand it had become. Nothing worked. Marlboro was also winning the battle on the factory floor. The entrenched traditions that kept Reynolds on top for 20 years now kept it from changing with the times. The reconstituted tobacco, long embraced by Reynolds manufacturing executives, saved money, but sacrificed quality. It produced a hot, harsh taste that was popular with blue-collar workers, but that, by the 1970s, was being rejected by more sophisticated and youthful palates. Marlboro, by blending a smoother cigarette, won converts. Philip Morris did it by pouring money into new plants and equipment, while Reynolds stood pat. After dominating the cigarette business for so long, the Reynolds line executives had grown complacent. What do those guys on Park Avenue know?" they said, doubting the judgment of anyone that distant from the factories and tobacco fields. In the mid-70s, both Philip Morris and Reynolds had a shot at purchasing a first generation of electronic cigarette-making machines that would greatly speed production. But many Reynolds mechanics weren't literate enough to handle them. They chose to stick with older, more reliable machines they knew how to take apart and reassemble. Philip Morris jumped at the new devices. By the time Reynolds realized its mistake, all the manufacturer's production was committed to Philip Morris plants. It was the final straw. In 1976, Marlboro passed Winston as America's best-selling cigarette, a position it holds to this day. Reynolds held on to its lead in overall cigarette sales by a hair. The problems weren't confined to the old brands, as a new product fiasco shook Reynolds further. It was a time when all-natural products were popular, and shortly after losing the #1 position to Marlboro, the company decided to roll out an all-natural cigarette. They named it Real. As usual, they ignored local skeptics. "What are we doing trying to sell to the health-conscious?" muttered one dissenter. "People who smoke don't give a shit about their health." But Reynolds executives were so confident of Real's success, they bypassed test markets and took it directly national. They spent millions on ads showing ruddy-cheeked young bucks enjoying a Real and passed out packs by the gross on street corners. Real, of course, was a real disaster. In the late 70s, Stick officially became chief executive upon Stokes's retirement, and Reynolds left its 50-year-old downtown headquarters for a sprawling, glass-enclosed building erected several miles away. Reynolds, one executive declared, had arrived at the age of mass, class, and glass. But the intrigues soon spawned within the new building would give it a far more colorful nickname, the Glass Menagerie. His only mistake, Paul Stick would later say, was that he had gotten too old too soon. He was past 60 by the time he became chief executive, and he no sooner had the job than speculation began about his successor. The early favorite was Tylee Wilson, a man with 2 years' experience running the company's overseas business, and the only one of the original new guard to make it into the 1980s. Stick named Wilson president in 1979. As Stick's number 2, Wilson was responsible for the company's entire tobacco operation. He had initially gained Stick's notice shepherding Reynolds's ragtag money-losing food businesses, bringing them to heel and managing to turn a profit. As president, Wilson began pouring billions into the gargantuan task of revitalizing Reynolds's aging factories. He soon rubbed the genteel Stick the wrong way. Wilson was a cold tactician and technician, a straight-ahead tank of an administrator who rolled over everything between him and his current objective. As a young man, he had been an army instructor, and he brought that blunt Prussian style to the executive suite. Wilson had a humorless laugh and a knack for tortured syntax. A Wilson sentence might begin, "I would opine that..." Stick's succession, it was clear, would be a horse race. The second entry in that race was Edward A. Horrigan, Jr., president of Reynolds's main tobacco business. Ed Horrigan, who would leave his own indelible mark on Reynolds, was a combative fireplug of a man who liked to brag he was born in a three-point stance. Horrigan was typical of the new generation executive Stick had brought in. He ran a tobacco business without ever having smoked in his life. He had made his career marketing liquor, joining Reynolds in the 70s and, unlike many of the new guard, fitting in well in Winston-Salem. He was born in Brooklyn, the son of an accountant who was hard-pressed to find work during Horrigan's Depression-era childhood. He got into the University of Connecticut on a football scholarship. Although only 5'7", by his own admission, he liked to hit people. Horrigan got through Yukon working summer construction jobs, then joined the Army. In Korea, Horrigan led a platoon of 200 men at the Battle of Old Baldy. The North Koreans were dug in on a hill, mowing down Americans as they tried to take it. But the young lieutenant kept regrouping, and finally led his decimated unit on one final assault. Horrigan took out a machine gun nest by himself, and his platoon took the hill. He won a Silver Star for valor, but his wounds knocked him out of combat for the duration. After Horrigan came home, he marched through a succession of marketing jobs until being lured to Reynolds by Tylee Wilson after heading the Buckingham liquor unit of Chicago conglomerate Northwest Industries. At Reynolds, the two old soldiers were natural allies, at least at first. Together they commiserated over drinks about Reynolds's plodding ways. Horrigan chafed at Reynolds's gentlemanly Southern work ethic. "We need a stronger sense of urgency here," he told his troops. Horrigan was brimming with pep talks for the troops. They were going to fight Philip Morris on the beaches, in the air, at the convenience store racks, everywhere. When they began to make progress, Horrigan got a good measure of the credit. Subordinates didn't question him without risking a tirade. Behind his back, they called him Little Caesar. These were not the gentlemanly qualities Stick preferred. Nonetheless, Horrigan was a contender. A third candidate for Stick's crown was Joe Abely, the suave chief financial officer recruited from General Foods. Abely most looked the part of a chief executive with a distinguished silver mane. He also had the best pedigree, with law and business degrees from Harvard. He was on the Council of Foreign Relations, which appealed to the statesman side of Stick. But Abely had a personality that made Wilson seem warm. While he didn't meet the gentility test, Abely worked closely with Stick on acquisitions and performed the useful task of bringing financial systems out of the Dark Ages. Sealand's accounting system, it was discovered, consisted of stuffing invoices in shoeboxes. After a century of one for all, the Stick succession scramble split Reynolds into warring camps. No longer did people pull together for the company. Now they looked after the interests of the executive they hitched their star to, Wilson, Horrigan, or Abely. Preparing for a financial analysts' meeting, Wilson and Abely quarreled over who would speak first, a squabble Stick finally had to settle. At a rehearsal for presentations to a company-wide conference, Abely had run over his allotted time when Horrigan stomped into the room. "What's that cocksucker doing up there?" he stormed. "It's my time." Abely ordered a feasibility study on spinning off Sealand. Wilson, to whom Sealand reported, got wind of it and confronted John Dowdall, the treasurer, who was doing the study. "I'm sorry I can't tell you about that," Dowdall said. "Abely will fire me if I tell you." Horrigan hired a public relations firm to get him nominated for the right kinds of business and humanitarian awards to enhance his resume. Horrigan's big score, a Horatio Alger Award. The succession mess would have a lasting effect on the business, fueling an insidious practice known as loading. Loading wasn't unique to Reynolds. Every tobacco company did it to some extent. Just prior to its regular semi-annual price hikes, Reynolds regularly offered huge volumes of cigarettes to its customers, wholesalers and supermarket chains, at the old prices. Customers loved it because they could sell low-cost cigarettes at the new higher prices. Reynolds loved it because it cleared away unwanted inventory, kept the factories humming, and, most important, produced large, artificial, end-of-quarter profits. The problem, of course, was that loading was as addictive as nicotine. In order to top profits aided by loading, the company had to load even more, and so on, ad infinitum. It created huge inventories in the hands of wholesalers and retailers. When those inventories couldn't be sold, one of two things happened, neither of them good. The cigarettes could be shipped back to Reynolds for credit, forcing the company to swallow the expense of reprocessing the tobacco into fresh cigarettes and, likely as not, reloading them. Or they could sit around for a few months, growing stale. As Reynolds grew more and more addicted to loading, more and more smokers were drawing on stale Winstons. Many would switch over to Marlboro. With Reynolds gripped in bitter political squabbling, Stick struggled to find a successor he could recommend to the board. A director named Ronald Grierson came to him with an idea. Grierson was a distinguished Briton, vice chairman of British General Electric. In Europe, Grierson told Stick, companies often went to handwriting experts when confronted with tough decisions like this, and so an oracle on such matters in Switzerland was consulted. She looked at writing samples of the successor candidates and shook her head morosely at each. Not competent, couldn't be trusted, and so on down the line. Stick stalled. Some believed he didn't want to make a decision. He was in his mid-60s, but felt as if he were in the prime of his late-blooming career. Then, just as those inside the company held their breath, waiting for his final decision, Stick made an even more startling announcement. He had agreed to buy a company named Heublein for $1.2 billion. What he got was a good liquor business, Smirnoff, Inglenook Wines, a mediocre fast food business, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Heublein's chief executive, Hicks Waldron, a fourth succession candidate. Waldron had spent most of his career at General Electric, a breeding ground for modern managers, and had a patina of polish Stick found lacking in the others. Waldron wasn't unmindful of the succession war gripping Reynolds. There were only a few key terms to Heublin's sale as far as Waldron was concerned: a price of $63 a share and a promise that Tylee Wilson wouldn't be made chief executive. Now the succession situation grew even more complex. In October 1982, Stick turned 65 and told the board he couldn't yet recommend a candidate to replace him. Instead, he asked for and received permission to stay on an extra year. There was little doubt his request would be approved. Since the mid-70s, Stick had been packing the board with his supporters. In an era when many American companies favored weak-willed rubber stamp boards, Reynolds' directors were unusually strong-minded. Among their most outspoken members was John McAmer, chief executive of Celanese, the chemical company. McAmer was chairman of the board's compensation committee, which was looking after the succession matter. He was Eastern establishment through and through: Yale undergraduate, Harvard Business School, Lincoln Center Board, International Chamber of Commerce, and close to Stick. Stick was on the Celanese board and had been on the search committee that installed McAmer in his job. As far as the Reynolds succession went, McAmer was an anybody-but-Wilson man. Celanese did $25 million of business a year with Reynolds, selling it material for cigarette filters. But Reynolds bought twice as much from Eastman Kodak, and when McAmer lobbied Wilson for more business, Wilson, no corporate politician, bluntly told him, "You're our secondary supplier for 2 reasons, quality and service." McAmer simmered. "I will not be on the board of a company run by Tylee Wilson," he declared. Vernon Jordan, the former Urban League president, was another director tight with the McAmer-Stick axis. He too served on the Celanese board. As a partner in the Washington law firm of Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, Jordan was well disposed to any chairman who put him on his board. Stick would often have Jordan along as his guest at Bohemian Grove, the exclusive Northern California corporate retreat, a superb place for the lawyer to do some rainmaking. Juanita Krebs also owed Stick. A longtime professor and administrator at Duke, Krebs was the token woman on Reynolds's board even before attaining modest fame as Jimmy Carter's Secretary of Commerce. Stick had gotten her on the board of Chrysler, where he was a director. Stick had Reynolds make handsome contributions to the Duke University endowment, of which Krebs was a trustee. Krebs got credit at Duke for the gift. Stick's name got attached to the largesse. At Duke, there was a J. Paul Stick Chair for International Studies and a J. Paul Stick Fellowship for Graduate Business School Study for a deserving alumnus of his alma mater, Grove City College. Another Stick supporter was Grierson, who Stick also maneuvered onto the Chrysler board. Stick could also count on Albert Butler of Winston-Salem, who headed a family textile business and, for many years, a Moravian Good Works Foundation. Butler was a creature of the local establishment who summered at Roaring Gap, golfed at Old Town, and sat on the boards at Wachovia and Wake Forest. Butler had been thrilled to be tapped for Reynolds's board and was utterly passive once on it. Bill Anderson, chairman of NCR Corporation, was the kind of international businessman that Stick could only pretend to be. Anderson had grown up in Shanghai and spoke several Chinese dialects. He had spent 4 years as a Japanese prisoner of war during World War II, and afterward was chief witness at a war crimes trial that sent 30 of his Japanese captors to prison. He had seen heavier scenes than the succession mess, at which he seemed slightly bemused. It was a powerful board, and squarely in Stick's pocket. But if the directors pampered Stick, they felt no obligation to treat his subordinates, or his successors, the same. Reynolds executives seethed at the way board members put them through the second degree. Paul had his own bevy of directors. They knew everything, and management knew nothing, Ed Horrigan recalled years later. He and they were using the company as a vehicle for self-aggrandizement. Horrigan's hostility was apparent to all. Some board members called him that trigger-happy whiskey salesman, hurting his chances for the top spot. "Always remember, they're only in it for themselves," the personnel chief Rodney Austin told colleagues. "They're mostly whores, pimps, and panderers." The succession scramble had been dragging on for 2 years when, in the wee hours of a Saturday morning in early 1983, Austin awoke Horrigan with a phone call to pass along a tip from one of the directors. Stuart Watson, the former chairman of Heublein and now a Reynolds director, had gone before the succession committee and made a case for his man, Hicks Waldron. The committee had bought it, Austin said. It looked like Waldron, the dark horse, had the job. As Horrigan raged at the development, Austin suggested it wasn't too late to recover. But your only hope is to get together with Ty and Jerry Long, tobacco's number 2 man, right now and stop it from happening. That weekend, Horrigan, Long, and Wilson met and agreed. Waldron had to be stopped. The best way to do that, they reasoned, was to use themselves as leverage. If they could bury the hatchet and form a united front behind either Wilson or Horrigan, they could derail the Waldron Express. On Monday, Wilson met with Stick and delivered him a handwritten letter. "We cannot accept Hicks Waldron as chairman or as CEO," Wilson wrote on behalf of the 3 men. "We believe the selection of Waldron as your successor would be an unnecessary sellout. We assume the committee believes the retention of the proven successful principal executives of this company is vital to its future. However, the selection of Waldron would result in the 3 of us leaving the company." It wasn't right that someone with no tobacco experience should get the job, the letter went on, especially because the best candidate was right under the board's nose. "We respectfully conclude that I am the most qualified candidate to succeed you," Wilson wrote. As much as Stick detested their demands, the trio had him in a corner. He couldn't lose his top 3 tobacco executives, not with Philip Morris poised to pass Reynolds as the nation's top tobacco company. Stick sent the succession committee copies of what was already being called, by the few who knew of it, the Midnight Letter. The directors were also furious, and they were also in a corner. As they thrashed about for an answer, Macamer was even advanced as a possible compromise candidate. It wouldn't be the last time he would do so. Debate ran on for weeks. During a marathon parley after the April annual meeting, there was still strong sentiment for Waldron. Finally, in May, at a Saturday meeting of the succession committee in Winston-Salem, Stick made his recommendation. The board reluctantly consented. Stick flew to Heublein headquarters in Hartford, Connecticut, to break the news to Waldron. "Hicks, I'm going to do something that I'm afraid isn't in the best interests of the shareholders, but I've got to do it," Stick said. "I'm naming Ty chief executive." Elevated to chief executive in 1983, Tylee Wilson set to work reshaping Reynolds. Like many in the new guard, Wilson's background had been in consumer products, and it was there he believed the company's future lay. He spun off Sealand to shareholders in 1984 and sent Joe Abele out to sea with it, ridding himself of a potential challenger. Wilson sold Ammonoil the same year for $1.7 billion, just before oil prices went into freefall. Wall Street analysts praised the changes and issued buy recommendations on Reynolds stock. Businessweek chimed in with a laudatory cover story declaring, "The consumer drives R.J. Reynolds again." They were smart moves. After its troubles during the 70s, Reynolds's tobacco business had begun what would become a long decline. In 1983, cigarette sales had crested and would fall a steady 2% each year to come. The rise of the anti-smoking movement, the antis Reynolds partisans spat, was taking its toll. By the early 80s, less than a third of Americans smoked. Federal excise taxes on cigarettes were doubled in 1983 to 16 cents a pack. Tobacco remained a fabulously profitable business. Prices were still raised twice a year, but even die-hard industry partisans saw the twilight ahead. By diversifying, Wilson was simply readying Reynolds for the inevitable. Horrigan was named Wilson's president and chief operating officer. Their alliance was a shaky one, but Wilson owed Horrigan for his role in drafting the Midnight Letter. Now, much as Wilson had grated on Stick, Horrigan grated on Wilson. When he had questions about the tobacco business, Wilson bypassed Horrigan and went to his henchman Jerry Long, who replaced Horrigan as president of the domestic tobacco business. A stickler for detail, Wilson criticized Horrigan for his weekend trips to Palm Springs, where the Horrigans had a home. Even though Horrigan often took along other executives, Wilson thought the trips more personal than corporate and challenged Horrigan's use of a corporate jet. "Ed, you're really stretching," Wilson said. Horrigan bristled. "You're challenging my integrity." When internal auditors later forced Horrigan to reimburse Reynolds for some trips, at the going rate of twice first-class airfare, Little Caesar threw a fit. Wall Street may have liked Wilson's ideas about remaking Reynolds, but they were greeted somewhat less enthusiastically by Paul Stick. Wilson was, after all, undoing a decade of his work. On his retirement, Stick remained a powerful board member, maybe the most powerful, and kept close tabs on Reynolds's inner workings. Wilson did everything possible to freeze him out. Stick's life revolved around the corporate jets, but when Wilson felt his trips were for personal business, he made sure Stick was charged for them. A retired chairman was entitled to an office and a secretary, and Stick got one, but in the old headquarters downtown, away from his beloved glass menagerie. "Stick is going to be my sexual consultant," Wilson was heard to say. "When I want his fucking advice, I'll ask for it." But Stick simply couldn't let go. He called department heads with questions or observations. He took calls from Hicks Waldron, passing along his former Heublein colleagues' complaints. One of the sorest points was the head of Del Monte's fresh fruit division, Sammy Gordon. He was a favorite of Stick, who liked the business and whose son worked for Gordon. Stick used the talkative Gordon to disseminate anti-Wilson gossip, Wilson thought. Stick defended Gordon for running his business like the freewheeling banana trader he was. Gordon's style ran counter to Wilson's bedrock belief in what he called process and procedure. Wilson lived for the trappings of bureaucracy. When it came to corporate decision-making, he was confident that if one went through the right steps and approvals, the right conclusions would follow. Process, Wilson told a gathering of senior executives shortly after taking office, can speed the smooth and orderly flow of most routine activities and permit us to devote valuable management time to exceptional or unanticipated concerns. As a maiden speech, it was an earnest declaration of principles. But it betrayed a rigidity and coldness that wouldn't win Wilson allies when he most needed them. Wilson would sometimes wander around headquarters, trying awkwardly to make small talk with middle managers, but he couldn't shed his brusque nature. When he thought the executive dining room was being cluttered by too many lower-level types, he ordered higher admission standards. RHIP, he crisply explained, then translated, rank has its privileges. From the outset, Wilson's relations with the Reynolds board were shaky. None of the directors condoned his strong-arm tactics in winning the chairmanship, and his treatment of their friend Stick wasn't appreciated. Wilson tried to build bridges, in his fashion. He sent directors briefing papers between board meetings. He scheduled one lunch a year with each director, during which he took copious notes as his guest aired whatever was on his mind. Wilson kept the notes in little books, one for each director. But where it mattered most, Wilson fell hopelessly short. John McAmer was still pestering him for business and getting rebuffed. When Vernon Jordan pressed for more legal work, Wilson would coolly reply that, as a non-lawyer, he couldn't judge whether there was anything appropriate. He referred Jordan to Reynolds's general counsel. In contrast to chief executives such as Paul Stick and Ross Johnson, who played their boards like a personal symphony orchestra, Wilson had a tin ear. He further alienated Stick and the board by diminishing an institution dear to their hearts, the International Advisory Board. Since its formation in the 70s, it had become a prime junketeering vehicle for Reynolds directors. Wilson cut the meetings back from 2 a year to 1 and removed Stick as the board's chairman, making the job a staff-run function. Wilson knew all the changes weren't met with pleasure by Stick or his board cronies, but both profits and the stock price were up, and he couldn't conceive of anyone arguing with his results. After unloading Ammonoil and Sealand, Wilson began preparations for his biggest move yet, an acquisition that would fulfill his grand vision to mold Reynolds into a consumer goods superpower to rival Procter & Gamble. Wilson set up a task force of Reynolds' staffers and representatives of the company's longtime Wall Street investment bank, Dillon Read and Company, to sift through and rank the candidates. After many months and countless computer studies, they came up with 3 recommendations. Second runner-up was PepsiCo, which scored 75 on Wilson's acquisition lust scale. Wilson approached it first, in part because he knew its chief executive, Wayne Calloway. But Wilson found Calloway as ice-cold as a Pepsi. "There's no way I'll discuss that with you, and if you come at me hostile, I'm going to fight you all the way," he said. Wilson backed off. First runner-up, with a score of 76, was Kellogg, the cereal giant. But half its stock was controlled by a trust, and Wilson doubted the trust would sell. That left the company that was number 1, with 81 points. Wilson demurred only briefly because he didn't know the chief executive. According to his task force, Reynolds's ideal marriage partner was Nabisco Brands, headed by a breezy, likable Canadian named Ross Johnson. "Oh yeah, I know who you are," said Johnson, who had bumped into Wilson a few times over the years. The 2 chief executives met the following week over sandwiches at Johnson's Midtown Manhattan office, and Wilson laid out his plan. Reynolds, he explained, needed a major acquisition to ease its reliance on tobacco, and he thought Nabisco fit the bill perfectly. As they spoke, the 2 men leafed through each other's annual reports. Relaxed and chatty, Johnson played it coy, not responding immediately. Wilson suspected Johnson would be receptive. He had picked up rumors that Nabisco and Philip Morris were sniffing at each other, and he thought Johnson would be motivated to sell. To make certain, Wilson threw in a sweetener. The 2 of them were the same age, Wilson noted, but he had no plans to remain chief until 65. Wilson told Johnson he planned to retire in 2 or 3 years, and hinted strongly that Johnson would get first crack at replacing him as head of their combined companies. The 2 talked terms and agreed that if they chose to pursue a merger, a tax-free stock swap made sense. They parted with plans to meet again in several weeks. Both had board meetings in the meantime, and each could get word on whether to proceed. Wilson had left Johnson's office sky-high, his grand vision apparently within reach. But when he met with his directors in late April 1985, he found them cool to the idea of merging with Nabisco. Some were downright angry. This would be the biggest deal in Reynolds' history. Why hadn't the board been told about it beforehand? The reason, Wilson noted testily, was that he and Johnson had had only the most preliminary of chats. No money on the table, no obligations, just a first date. What about this business of promising Johnson a shot at the chairmanship? The board members protested. Succession was their prerogative. The directors didn't like the idea of a tax-free merger either. If any deal was done, Reynolds ought to do the buying. In a stern rebuke, they ordered Wilson to back off. Wilson remained confident. "This is still going to happen. It makes so much sense," he assured Horrigan over lunch. "But the next time, Ross Johnson isn't going to have so much power. We'll be the acquirer. All he'll get is vice chairman." The talks, in fact, rekindled within weeks. A small army of Wall Street lawyers and investment bankers were brought in, and, the directors having been convinced, Reynolds agreed in principle to acquire Nabisco for cash. The lone sticking point was the price. Then, during the negotiations, Nabisco stock began rising, a sure sign that word of the talks had leaked. Johnson took it as an opportunity to wheedle more money out of Wilson. At $80 a share, Wilson said he could go no further. "Well," Johnson said, "you're not going to get a deal at $80. The logjam broke when Wilson agreed to throw in preferred stock, which brought the price to $85 a share, or $4.9 billion, at the time the largest merger ever to take place outside the oil industry. Johnson, sensing Wilson's hunger for the deal, drove tough bargains on side issues. Despite Stick's love of corporate jets, Reynolds's perks trailed those of Nabisco. Most everything was negotiable, Johnson said, but not the perks. Wilson thought company apartments for all the top officers of a cookie and cracker company was ridiculous. But he wasn't giving up his dream over Johnson's petty concerns. He gave in. Johnson insisted he be named President and Chief Operating Officer, number 2 behind Wilson. He characterized it as a signal to Nabisco people that they wouldn't be forgotten. Wilson gave in to that, too. The problem, of course, was that by elevating Johnson, he would be forced to demote the proud, tempestuous Horrigan. Wilson broke the news to him gently, promising to give him a sweet contract, the post of vice chairman, and a place in a new 3-man office of the chairman. Horrigan, seeing he had no choice, relented, taking solace in the fact he would be part of a troika ruling a vast new empire. On the last day of May 1985, the Reynolds board met in a teleconference to wrap up the details. Horrigan, en route to Australia to inspect Reynolds' troops there, stopped by Del Monte's San Francisco offices to listen in. Wilson, in New York for the negotiations, ticked off the final terms item by item, leaving the management structure for last. Ross Johnson will become the President and Chief Operating Officer, he said. Ed has agreed to accept the position of Vice Chairman. I want to hear from Ed on this, John Hanley of Monsanto asked. Is that acceptable to you? Horrigan made a gracious little speech, wholly out of character, some thought, that he had written for the occasion. For several minutes, he rhapsodized about the need to sacrifice his ambitions for the greater good. Afterward, Wilson came back on the line. There would be an Office of the Chairman, he announced, consisting of Wilson and Johnson. He didn't mention Horrigan. In San Francisco, Horrigan was dumbstruck. Wilson had waited until the conclusion of his self-effacing speech, then stolen the one sop Horrigan felt he had been thrown in the entire deal. Horrigan listened in a fog of rage as the directors finished the meeting. Ty, he said, when this call is over, I want you to call me. Very well, Ed, Wilson said in his clipped manner. For a minute, Horrigan sat alone. He began to cry, his fury and frustration producing tears that were streaming down his cheeks in torrents when Wilson finally called. I don't believe what you just said in that goddamned call, Horrigan stormed. We had an agreement that I was in that office. He raged on about how he had a good mind to resign, how dishonest a son of a bitch Wilson was, how he had been played for a patsy in front of the whole board. Now calm down, Ed, calm down. I am not going to calm down, Horrigan shouted. Unless you change this and put me in that office of the chairman, I will recant everything I just said to the board. I will blow this whole thing out of the water. I'm not budging from this phone until you call back and get our deal back. Wilson called Johnson and told him it would be necessary to include Horrigan in the office of the chairman. Johnson, wholly ignorant of Wilson's deception and of Reynolds' politics in general, readily agreed. Wilson relayed the message to Horrigan, singing praises of Johnson's willingness to compromise. But Horrigan held Johnson equally accountable for the slight. He knew all about how Johnson had seized power at Standard Brands and Nabisco. Horrigan figured Johnson was angling to purge him even before the merger was completed. Ty, I wish you a lot of luck, Horrigan said. Ross Johnson will have your job in 18 months, just remember that. The hell he will, Wilson retorted. We made a deal. He'll get the job when I retire. Deal, hell, Horrigan snorted. When the merger was completed several days later, a delighted Wilson was in Washington for a Ford Theater gala, where he ran into Johnson's good friend, Jim Robinson of American Express. Robinson was Atlanta-born and bred, occasionally summered at his mother's home in Roaring Gap, and knew both Nabisco and Reynolds well. Johnson, in fact, had consulted Robinson at length during the merger negotiations. You'll like Ross, Robinson said in his soft Southern accent. He's a good guy, and I know you'll get along well together. For the most part, the first weeks following the merger went smoothly, though there were undercurrents of uneasiness that would resurface. Because Reynolds had acquired Nabisco, news of the merger was greeted favorably in Winston-Salem, where the locals took pride in gaining control of a great northern company. The lone dissenting voice was Horrigan, who settled into a black Irish funk. Horrigan groused constantly to Wilson about the Nabisco executive's perks, about how Laurie Johnson was always traveling with Ross when that was forbidden by company policy. "Ross Johnson is a snake, a low-life slime," he declared to anyone who would listen. "We'll rue the day we hooked up with that character." When Ty and Pat Wilson gave a brunch to welcome the Johnsons to Winston-Salem, Ed and Betty Horrigan were conspicuous in their absence. Johnson was soon down on Horrigan, too, although he was incapable of hating, as Horrigan did. "There's no way I will ever have Ed Horrigan reporting to me," he told friends. "I don't like him, and I don't trust him." Sometimes Johnson mused about whether Horrigan was on the take from the liquor distributors who did business with Heublein, a unit that reported to Horrigan. The more Johnson learned about Horrigan, the less use he had for him. "Ed's a dead man when I'm running this company," Johnson vowed. Apart from Horrigan, Johnson was initially well received at Reynolds. Alone among senior Nabisco executives, Johnson moved to Winston-Salem, where he bought a large house off an old town fairway. He was reported to be a thoroughly winning fellow, a smiling, backslapping yin to Wilson's tight Prussian yang. "I know what they said about this guy, but I don't find it to be true at all," gushed Rodney Austin. "I think he's great." In his first weeks in Winston-Salem, Johnson made an all-out effort to fit in, driving around in a Jeep Wagoneer, inviting people over to dinner, and joining the board of the North Carolina Zoological Society. Most in Winston-Salem were impressed, but not all. Ginny Dowdle, the wife of Reynolds treasurer John Dowdle, sized up Johnson with a single phrase: a used car salesman. Below the top ranks, deep differences in the two organizations were soon apparent. When Reginald Starr, head of the Reynolds Shareholder Services Department, flew to New Jersey for a first meeting with his Nabisco counterparts, he was met at its Morristown hangar by a pair of white limousines with smoked windows. "I don't know, it looked like mafia to me." Starr, a 30-year Reynolds veteran, said, "It was so ostentatious. I was ashamed to be seen in one of those things." Wilson's first meeting at Nabisco went no better. As he stepped off a Reynolds jet into the Morristown terminal, he was smoking a cigarette. "Hey, no smoking in here," barked Nabisco's flight operations chief, Linda Galvin. Startled, Wilson dropped the cigarette to the floor and crushed it out. If that weren't enough, the Reynolds contingent found the Nabisco people patronizing. On the return flight, Nancy Holder, Reynolds's meetings planner, took Wilson aside. "Ty, be careful," she said. "Standard Brands merged with Nabisco, and now there's no Nabisco left." Paul Bott, a top planner, scoffed, "Nancy, don't be silly. Ty's too smart for that." Even the two companies' products were an uneasy, some said unnatural, mix. Early on, Horrigan learned that one of Nabisco's brands, Fleischmann's Margarine, had developed a joint marketing campaign with the American Heart Association that, among other things, urged consumers not to smoke. Horrigan hit the roof. The campaign was soon dropped. Johnson, of course, made light of combining wholesome Nabisco and the death merchants at Reynolds. "Mom and apple pie meet the skull and crossbones," he chuckled. But to Nabisco's old guard, it was no laughing matter. If the stolid Nabisco bakers had derided Standard Brands' liquor managers as the booze boys, they were even more horrified at joining a tobacco company. In Washington, RJR Nabisco created two political action committees, one for Reynolds, one for Nabisco. Nabisco employees didn't want their contributions going to the tobacco lobby. Johnson, who for the most part enjoyed wonderful relations with the Nabisco and Standard Brands boards, immediately sensed the tensions between Wilson and the Reynolds directors. After the first meeting of the combined board, he got a strong impression of cliquishness and peevishness. Off to one side, Stick, McAmer, Jordan, and Krebs huddled to discuss something secretively. Out of earshot, Wilson complained about the directors and some imagined slight. Wilson didn't like them, and they didn't like him, recalled Johnson. It was clear there was a lot of scar tissue there. 5 Nabisco directors, including Andy Sage, were named to RJR Nabisco's 20-person board. One, Charles Hugel, the amiable chief of Connecticut-based combustion engineering, lunched with Wilson shortly after coming aboard and was stunned to hear him openly criticize other directors. Wilson railed at each in detail as Hugel stared in wonder. Why is he telling me this? Hugel thought. How did he expect to win me over by telling me how his board was a bunch of jerks? What kind of instincts does this guy have anyway? As far as the actual business was concerned, the theory behind the merger was that by combining Reynolds's huge line of products with Nabisco's, the new company could command greater sway with buyers, demanding more and better shelf space in supermarkets and deeper discounts from wholesalers. Wilson was certain that, by following his beloved process and procedure, success was inevitable. He set up task forces to study joint marketing arrangements, cross-fertilization of management, and other ways to exploit what must be tremendous potential. If it was Stick's aspiration to walk with kings, it was Wilson's to be the hero of a Harvard Business School case study. Johnson's merry men, of course, thought Wilson was nuts. To a man, they remained at Nabisco in New York, where they found themselves powerless to fight bosses in far-off Winston-Salem. Under Wilson, any strategic move, from advertising to changing a cookie box, required multiple sign-offs and weeks of waiting. The Nabisco people could believe neither the size of Wilson's staff nor the obtuseness of its exercises. One task force studied how to assemble a telecommunications and computer system that would tie together the whole empire. To Wilson, it was a grand-scale means of achieving efficiencies. To Nabisco, it was a nightmare. Said John Gora, a Nabisco Candy Division executive, it was like we'd been bought by the federal government. Isolated from Johnson, many of his longtime aides grew restless. After just 6 months under Wilson's regime,